Steve Lonhart. He is a senior scientist for NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and also for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. For the sanctuary, he oversees SIMON, which is the Sanctuary Integrated Monitoring Network, and he is just a wonderful speaker, and I know you're going to enjoy this. Steve Lonhart.
Thank you. You did a great job with all the acronyms. So thanks, folks, for being here. Today what I'm going to do is talk about warm water anomalies and some of the critters that have been showing up. I just want to start by saying, as Steve pointed out, that I work for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We've got a series of contiguous sanctuaries here on the West Coast. And as if you were here for Jim Vanderzwan's talk, you know, he was mentioning about this California current that's coming right down along our coast and does a lot of things both in terms of driving weather patterns, contributes to our climate, and also lately has been influencing what kinds of critters you see in different areas. So I'm going to do a little bit of kind of biology 101 so that we're all on the same page. So just bear with me on this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about where species are, where they occur, where they don't occur, and a little bit of why that is. So if you're looking at a graphic here, just an idealized graphic where you look at the performance of a species, how well do they do? And then you look on this axis, and it's some variable. And here I've said, well, let's look at temperature, for example. There's this sort of idealized curve where there's an optimum spot where the species does very well, and as you move either to the extremes of, in this case for temperature, cold or hot, they don't do quite as well. So if you were to plot this out and look at it from the perspective of individuals, down here on these parts, the tail ends of the curve there, they don't survive. Okay? It's either too hot or too cold. And if you were to move a little bit further in, while it's not optimal, actually individuals can survive, but they have just enough energy and are basically only at the level of survival for individuals. Now, if you move a little bit more in towards the optimum area, you can see where individuals can not only survive, but they can grow, they can maybe they can reproduce and sort of keep the population at a certain level. But when you're really in that sweet spot in the center area here, where you've got an optimum temperature, and this could also be salinity, this could be pH, this could be any of a number of environmental factors, that's where the population is really growing. So I showed you that figure to give you an idea of not all organisms occur in all places in the world because there are things that are precluding them from being there, and a lot of it has to do with their physiology. So if we look at, for example, the coast of the West Coast here, kind of going from Washington area down to the tip of Baja, California, and on this plot we're looking at the abundance of a species. There's been this sort of idealized curve, very similar to the one you just saw, that talks about where the individuals of a single species might occur. That there would be a spot along the coastline where you tend to get most of the individuals, and as you go either towards the equator or towards the pole, they start to diminish in number. Okay? So that's the idealized plot. When we think about that, we're describing the geographic range of a species, where it occurs in the ocean or on the intertidal. Now, that's the idealized sort of version. Here's what it actually looks more like in reality. So this is for this limpet that occurs in the intertidal. This is one of the species that if you were to go out right out here and start climbing around on the rocks on a low tide, you'd see it very readily. And here, this is sort of the range of it, and actually it actually has an abundance near the range endpoint. So it isn't that nice sort of monotonic increase towards the center and then a decline towards the equator. It actually is up and down. So you know, this just points out that, you know, nature is a little bit more complicated than the simple models we create in trying to understand it. Okay, the next thing is to just briefly talk about what influences sort of the range of a species. The first thing I want to point out is probably most of you may not really think about it because it really is on the time scale of the entire duration of a species. So we're talking about, you know, millions of years usually. And so if you look at the range here on the axis, basically how much of the planet that organism, that species occupies, from the point where it speciates and actually is its own distinctive species to the point that it becomes globally extinct, it's not here anymore, there's probably some sort of function where it kind of goes up and it increases, it might hit a maxima, and then as the species starts rolling into, towards inevitable and extinction, the distribution of it declines. The other one that we're probably more aware of, and when we think about where species occur, is not over the course of their evolutionary history, but where are they and how are they responding to the environment. And for those of you who just saw Jim's talk, we realize we have weather changes, so the environment is changing on days to weeks. We also have climate change, where you've got change in the environment that's happening on the order of years to decades to even longer. And so this is just a plot showing, this is from not quite a week ago, looking at the sea surface temperature along the coast of California, and it's going from about 10 degrees Celsius in the purple out to about almost 20 in the red. So that's kind of what the satellite is showing us, what the weather was on the 19th, which whatever that was, on Tuesday or Wednesday when I grabbed this off of the NOAA website. So clearly organisms respond to that. Some of them might not want to be in the warm water, so if they can move, they might be swimming out into warmer water or down the coast into warmer water, and vice versa if they prefer colder climates. The other thing that really is important when you're talking about where do species occur is the ability of humans to actually determine that, which is something that people say, well, I have a field book and it says this critter is supposed to be here. Well, the information is usually incomplete except for just a few species that are very well studied, or there may not be a lot of them. So our ability to accurately describe this dynamic process oftentimes means we don't really know what the answer is, if this is something new or not. Okay, and then the last little bit of sort of biology 101 is, so where do we say it occurs here and it doesn't occur there? Where do we draw the line, so to speak? And this is a plot from a paper where the scientist was saying, well, if you look at this purple area, this is all where you have the individual, it occurs, they can freely move with one another, it's a stable population, they're all connected to one another. You also have stable populations in the solid green that are not connected with one another and may only be intermittently connected with one another, but they are stable in and of themselves. And as you start moving up this sort of plot, this map, you get into areas where they're unstable. So you might only see those individuals for part of the year or for a few years, and then they disappear and they're locally extinct. Doesn't mean they're globally extinct, it just means you don't see them there all the time. And this is, when we're talking about populations, this is not a migratory thing, oh, they just come through at a certain time of the year. This is really about whether a population of that species persists in an area. And as you go further and further up, then you get into these ephemerals where you see them periodically, but it's usually one or two individuals. They're there for a little bit, and then they're gone. Sometimes they're blown in by a freak storm if it's a bird or something like that, and a lot of the folks who are birders in the area are always very excited when something from the tropics shows up, because it's not supposed to be here and the bird just couldn't fight the winds and showed up. But that's really an ephemeral sighting. And then we have this, what the scientists who wrote this paper talk about, these anomalous ones. It just shouldn't be here. We don't know why it's here, and it's maybe only been seen once or twice in the history of keeping track of these kinds of things. So where do you say, oh, that's where that organism, that species stops? Some people would say, well, it has to be where it's a stable population. I don't count any of these as records of where it occurs. Other people say, oh, no, they get here periodically, so we should include that in the range of the species. And yet others go, if you've seen it somewhere, I don't care if it was dead and floating in the water, it got there at some point, so we're going to call that the range limit. And actually the guy who originally wrote this was a Russian, and this was the zone of death, basically, where he truly was talking about bodies floating into areas and saying, well, it showed up here. This turtle is here in Alaska, but it had no intent of swimming there, and it wasn't even alive when it showed up. I wish I could speak Russian to read the actual original, because I think it'd be pretty entertaining. Okay, so this is one of the shots that Jim, I thought he was going to show, but didn't, so I'll do it for Jim. Here's where we have El Ninos back in the 97, 98 El Nino. This is this anomalous sea surface temperature, so this is a couple of degrees above normal. Wherever it's white, that's normal relative to previous decades, and wherever it's blue, it's colder than normal. Now, if we compare this El Nino event, the 97-98 El Nino, to the current one that we're experiencing, you notice that we also have that big red stretch going across South America, sort of along the equator. But also notice we've got these big red patches up here that you didn't see back in 1997, 1998. And that's why I asked Jim about this other phenomenon, which probably most of you have heard about, that was really in the news before all the ENSO news started hitting the wires, was the fact that we've got this thing that people have termed the blob. And it's a blob of warm water that's been sort of moving. Sometimes there's one or two blobs, but it's been persistent starting late 13 and almost all of last year. And that really was driving a lot of the warm water temperatures that we were seeing prior to the El Nino being declared by NOAA that it was an El Nino. We were clearly in an El Nino state, but the criteria for declaring that hadn't been met at that point. And so here's February of March in 2015, this really high, and so this is looking at temperatures that are 2 or more degrees above normal. And that's where we were saying, you know, people in Monterey were experiencing temperatures like they hadn't for a long time. And for me, I'm born and raised here in Monterey, so I remember the 82, 83 El Nino. I was in high school. I remember going to the beach those summers and being able to body surf and just do all kinds of things. No wetsuit needed. And at the time I thought, oh, this is great. The ocean's wonderful. And then kind of 84, 85, I hit the water and, you know, my breath was taken away because I'd gotten used to doing some swimming in an anomalous year, in a year where the El Nino was cranking up. So anyways, we've got these other factors. So there are these two environmental issues that organisms are dealing with. We have the El Nino that's underway right now, but we've also had this blob that's been impacting the distribution of species for the last couple of years. So I'm going to give you now some pictures of organisms that we've seen, either I personally have seen as a diver for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, or folks I work with, collaborators at UC Santa Cruz or Stanford Hopkins Marine Station or at CSU Monterey Bay. So I wanted to just point out that we have lots of different categories of rare and unusual sightings. The first of which being we've never seen it before, and we actually have an organism that has never been recorded in Central California before, okay, in sort of human history of record. We've also seen something that's rare but occurs during an El Nino, and that particularly was happening towards the end of last year as the El Nino was ramping up. We also have some things where we have adults that occur here and persist here as adults, but we never see any of the juveniles, the little babies. And now those recruits in the last year were very obvious, and I'll show you pictures of several of those, these little young. And then in some cases we've seen organisms in different habitats, so they're actually expanding where they occur. So it's not just that you have, oh, I know there's that one organism, it can be found at Point Lobos, and that's it. Now you start seeing that same species in other areas where you don't typically see it. So it's actually expanding its local range, so to speak. We have an interesting situation where an organism that I'll show you was described, the type locality where that specimen was in a museum and was used to describe that species, give it the Latin name, say why it's different from something else, was found in Santa Cruz, okay? That was over 100 years ago. Since I've been diving in this area since the late 80s, I'd never seen this organism here. But now I have seen it again. So it used to be common, and for whatever reason it's gone, and now we've seen a resurgence, at least in one area. And then other organisms that were abundant that actually declined. One of the things that most people think about is as the ocean warms, they think about all the organisms that are coming up from Mexico, from Central America, that are following that warm water. But remember, you've got species that are here that are not really interested in living in warm water. It's not near their temperature optimum, so they're actually going to be moving northward. So as you have new neighbors moving in, some of the neighbors are taken off because the climate is no longer suitable for them. So I'm going to start off with the craziest one. This is a photo of a barred knife jaw, and this was a live specimen collected off of Del Monte Beach, just over there, just a couple stones throw away, and no one could explain. This is a fish that typically occurs Sea of Japan, South China Sea. It's like, how did this get to California? And what most people think is there's actually probably two likely mechanisms. The one that's kind of spooky, but we have evidence of other organisms doing this, is the JTMD, that's the Japanese tsunami marine debris. So in 2011, when the tsunami hit, there was a lot of material that was basically floating from the harbors and inland that has now been moving slowly across the Pacific. Some of it's been caught up in the California currents heading its way south. And you've probably seen the news, like a boat or a soccer ball showing up a year, 2, 3 years after the event. They've seen that in some cases, floating material like either a skiff, like a small boat, or other things that can capture water in them, they've seen fish that survive in that water as they're moving across the Pacific. They're avoiding predation, and they're finding something that's suitable for them to eat. So there was some thought that that might be one of the mechanisms. The other one, which is much more common, not necessarily for this species, but for many species, is someone has an aquarium, they're moving, the fish got too big, they don't want it anymore, and they go, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to return it to the wild, not realizing that the fish they have, or maybe even realizing the fish they have, is not from around here. And so there's sometimes these situations, and usually if it's a tropical fish going into the Monterey Bay, it doesn't have much of a chance of surviving because of that graphic I was showing. It's not going to be near any optimum for growth and probably not for survival. But that's one possibility. Or one of the other two possibilities. This is a species that definitely came up in the currents as a larva. Okay, these were not brought up as adults. This is an urchin, Arbacia stellata, and the only record we have of it in California prior to this were two of them. One was down in Southern California in the 30s and 40s. They saw a few individuals down there, and then during the 97-98 El Nino, on the Channel Islands, okay, just off the coast of Southern California, they found a few of these individuals in some areas where they were doing kelp forest monitoring. And then they died off and haven't been seen since. They're normally found in Baja, California, and further south. So much to the surprise of divers who I work with on a regular basis in the summer, where we're doing monitoring of the marine protected areas here in the sanctuary and in Central California, found live adult individuals of these, and so now they've been taken up and placed at the California Academy of Sciences and voucher specimens. We have a new possible range extension depending on where you like to put lines for this particular species. We've also had one that probably many of you may have seen. If you live here, you might have gone down to the beach to see this phenomenon, where you've got a lot of these pelagic red crabs that come in and basically flood the beaches with lots of little red bodies. And this is something that's very much an El Nino related event. What I've done here is, this is from a paper in the 1960s. It's an interesting one. I point this out to students. I said, you can't, even though this is a peer-reviewed scientific paper, published, vetted, etc., they talk about, well, in March of 1895, these specimens washed up in Monterey, California. And they go on to talk about the oceanic conditions and says, well, remember, this is a species that was, and they reference Stimson in 1860. And it's like, wait a sec, how did they go into the future 35 years for referencing a paper from 1860? Literally in the very first line here, they inverted those two numbers. 59 should be there, 1859 instead of 1895. So I always tell students, even though this is, real science, people still screwed up. And for me, I was cracking up. It's like the third word in was messed up. Here's another one that you've probably seen in the Herald, or if you're up in Santa Cruz in the Sentinel. These are pictures from the Sentinel. This is here in Monterey, and this is up in the Santa Cruz area. These fine-scaled triggerfish, which they do occur as far north of as Alaska, but it's usually during these crazy El Nino events. That's not normally where you find something that looks like it should be in Hawaii or some other tropical location. So we've had some of them, and this was in 14 and 15, both in the summer. People were finding these fish, catching them actually. And one was seen at Point Lobos in the state park. And whenever someone says, a diver says, I saw this tropical fish, all the buddies go, oh, you're crazy. That doesn't occur. So now everyone's got cameras and GoPros attached to them. So there's almost now always photographic evidence. This is one of those cases where I said, we see the adults up here, but we rarely see the juveniles. And this is only a few centimeters long. This is a young black Smithchromis. And they have this beautiful coloration, this vibrant coloration, these gold tails. If you dive in Southern California, Channel Islands, you see them all the time at the right time of the year when they're reproductive. Up here, you don't. So usually you have to wait to see the adults. We've also the same thing for Kelp Bass. This is in the Monterey Harbor. These guys look very similar to some of our rockfish that occur here, but this is a species that is much more associated with Southern California and Baja California. We also had another species that's associated with Southern California in the sheephead. And so here's some, these are screen grabs from a GoPro right off of Lover's Point this summer. And we saw these guys striking white stripe and black dots. Here's a really nice picture from Southern California. And so again, we were seeing the young of these individuals that you can find the adults here year-round. Very few of them, but we were being flooded by young of the year recruits that were coming up from Southern California. And then the other one is Kellett's whelk. This is a big snail that normally you just see the large adults, which are about 15 centimeters long, and they'll lay eggs and they'll go through the whole reproductive process, but you don't see the young show up, except during El Nino years. And here are lots of these 10 to 15 centimeter long little guys that were all over the place. And I spent several years for my dissertation studying these guys, and I never saw the little guys here. I could go down to Southern California, dive in San Diego, see them all over the place. And then during an El Nino year, boom, they would show up. And then here's another urchin, and this is an interesting one. This is a white urchin that's also very common down in Southern California. And Dr. John Pierce, who's a retired faculty from UC Santa Cruz, was talking about, you know what, this species surprisingly actually occurs in deeper, colder water, which is usually not what happens. When you usually move north in latitude, a species actually gets shallower trying to stay in warmer water, as opposed to going deeper into colder water. And so next time we find any of these, it'd be really interesting to collect some of them for genetic analysis to see if they're more closely related to a population from Southern California versus this kind of hidden population in the deeper waters that we don't see because they're usually below diving depths, and they're pretty small, so sometimes ROVs and submersibles may not see them. This is one species. The type locality is in Santa Cruz. This is a beach towel-sized alga, Laminaria, that I always told people, you're never going to see this up here. It just doesn't occur up here. And sure enough, in this last year, we've been seeing it right off of Lover's Point. And then the other thing, we've always had purple urchins, but for whatever reason, probably 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, we've had a huge recruitment of purple urchins show up, and now they're growing up to a size where we can actually see them. And these areas become dominated by urchins. They're very actively grazing. Here, this is on the stipe of a kelp, and they're just mowing things down. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few years with this explosion of urchins, which has also been coupled with an explosion of brittle stars in certain areas. Again, another species you see normally in Southern California, and there's certain areas where the entire bottom is coated with thousands of them per square meter. It's been really an impressive change. And then I'll end the last picture of a critter is this one, chromodoris mcfarlandi. I took this picture off of Del Monte Beach in a spot where folks said, oh, that's where you'll see them. And then I hardly ever saw them anywhere else again until this past summer. And here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them in one spot. So I went essentially 15 years of diving, about 150 dives a year, never seeing them, and then they were all over the place in 2014, relatively speaking. So now what? So we need to keep doing observations, report this stuff, collect specimens is one of the things we do, one of the things that scientists do to try and figure out what is it, get the experts in the museums to look at them, and then voucher them for future generations. Collect lots of imagery and video, which we can do very inexpensively now, and disseminate this information broadly because we want other people to know, hey, are you seeing this thing now? Maybe you weren't aware of it. Maybe you guys should be looking for it. Keep exploring new areas. Sometimes we go to places and you only see some of these explosions in particular spots, so you have to be thorough in where you look. And then what we've been doing is we've been modifying how we do monitoring and science. We've been adding species onto lists because they're showing up. So the last two slides are, hey, if you're interested in this kind of information, if you want to see more pretty pictures, if you want to learn more about these species, we have a free app that's called Sea Photo. It's both for the Android and the iPhone platforms. Just check it out in your app store. Sea Photo, all one word. Lots of information on species, pictures, and their natural history. Or you can go to our website. As Steve mentioned, I work for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, in particular for the Sanctuary Integrated Monitoring Network program. And our website is sanctuarysimon.org. We have lots of information on the research and monitoring that's taking place in the sanctuary. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you
yes,
very
Steve.
much, Steve Lonhart. We're on a tight schedule, so maybe 1, 2 questions at the most.
Yes, so Steve was asking the question about those urchin barrens. Where do they occur? Because typically you wouldn't expect to see that where they overlap with sea otters, because sea otters love to feed on urchins. They are co-occurring, so those urchin barrens are at Butterfly House in Carmel Bay. They're right off of Coral Street, Point Pinos, so areas that have very high densities of sea otters who are actively foraging in the areas. And we actually have funding right now to kind of look at and work with Tim Tinker with USGS and other folks to look at what's going on, particularly with this new resource that's become available, and why aren't otters switching on it. My guess is, not an otter expert, but once they kind of do a little bit of a switch and start getting these urchins that get bigger and bigger and bigger and more profitable to feed on, they're gonna wipe them out in those areas. But for now, I think they're a little bit too small. But we're not sure, so we're going to actually do some experiments to try and look at that.
One more question? If not, okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Steve. Great job.